It started as something nobody could imagine. Washington and Tokyo, partners forged over decades, tied by military bases, joint defense programs, constant security coordination, and an economy interwoven with thousands of invisible threads, were suddenly drifting apart. Now the headlines scream of a crisis in US-Japan relations. The Financial Times describes an unprecedented rift between the two allies. Nikkei warns that Asia-Pacific stability faces a systemic threat. Reuters sources within the Japanese government reveal that trust in Donald Trump is evaporating rapidly. The cause? A devastating trade war launched by the White House against its largest Asian ally. Everything began with tariffs. Trump, back in the White House pushing his America First agenda, turned once again to his go-to weapon, tariffs. Where once China had been the primary target, this time Japan took the full brunt. Cars, electronics, steel, household appliances. Tariffs in these sectors shot up sharply under Trump's orders, justified as a response to unfair advantages held by Japanese companies. To the American public, this rhetoric sounded familiar, almost routine. But in Tokyo, it was a shock that cut deep. For the first time in decades, a sitting U.S. president openly disrespected an ally whose economy had long underpinned the stability of American markets. In a closed parliamentary session, reported by Asahi Shimbun, Japan's prime minister said, "If the U.S. treats us as an adversary, we are forced to defend ourselves as an adversary." That declaration marked a seismic shift. Japan's response was swift and unthinkable until then. Suddenly, measures that had been taboo were openly discussed. Bloomberg reports that the Japanese government is considering restrictions on exports to the U.S. of goods deemed strategically critical. One of the first targets? Fish, especially tuna. To Americans, this may seem abstract, but experts understand the critical role Japanese tuna plays in the U.S. food industry. Sushi bars, fine dining, and West Coast supply chains rely heavily on these imports. The U.S. Department of Agriculture states that over 70% of premium-grade tuna comes from Japan. Now that supply line is at risk of being cut. According to Nikkei, Japan already has a phased plan ready. First, cap export quotas, then move to a complete ban if the U.S. does not retreat from its tariff stance. But the threat doesn't stop at seafood. According to insiders speaking to the Wall Street Journal, Tokyo is preparing a far graver move, selling off part of its massive holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan remains one of the largest holders of U.S. government debt, owning over $1 trillion in bonds. This financial muscle is both a shield and a weapon. Should Japan decide to sell off significant amounts, the fallout would be catastrophic. Even modest sell-offs could spark panic in the U.S. bond market, push interest rates up, weaken confidence in the dollar, and ignite a new financial crisis. Washington knows this. Still, Trump appears to be intentionally playing a dangerous game. On his Truth Social account, he declared, "America will no longer feed other countries. For too long, we have allowed Japan to exploit our markets. Starting today, we put America first." In Tokyo, these words were seen as a public humiliation. Japanese politicians privately labeled Trump unpredictable and dangerous. A former ambassador to the U.S. told NHK bluntly, "This leadership style destroys the trust built over decades." Meanwhile, China moves quietly but decisively. According to the South China Morning Post, secret talks have already taken place between Chinese and Japanese officials on energy cooperation and currency settlements. Beijing clearly senses that the unraveling of U.S.-Japan ties opens a historic window of opportunity. If Washington doesn't reverse course, Japan may pivot decisively towards China. This would be disastrous for the United States. A country whose economy had for decades been the backbone of American interests in Asia could now find itself pulled into Beijing's orbit. Inside Japan, the debate grows louder and more intense. A Yomi Shimbun poll shows that over 42% of citizens now believe the U.S. alliance no longer guarantees their security, the highest level in 20 years. Younger generations increasingly look to China, attracted by investment, market access, and technology partnerships that come without humiliating conditions. Economists are already drawing parallels to the early 2010s when China restricted exports of rare earth metals to Japan. Back then, it was a warning shot. Now the stakes are even higher. The fragile trust that held together a decades-long partnership is cracking, and the consequences will reverberate far beyond the Pacific. Japan is now gearing up to send a strong signal against the United States, a move that Washington dreads deeply. If Japan's trust is lost, it wouldn't just trigger economic headaches but cause a massive strategic blow to America's position in the Pacific. The entire alliance system in the region, the backbone of containing China's ambitions, depends on the U.S.-Japan partnership. Should that partnership collapse, the power balance would instantly tilt. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines would be forced to rethink their alliances, and China would gain not only a critical economic partner, but also a top-tier military ally. Reports from the Financial Times reveal that Japanese investors have quietly started trimming their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. While the numbers remain relatively small for now, the pattern is unmistakable. Investors claim they're diversifying and managing risk, but everyone understands this is a clear political message. Japan is prepared to play hardball, and if the current U.S. This shift could become permanent and irreversible. The bitter irony here is that America itself is pushing its staunchest ally toward China's embrace. The more Washington proclaims its ambition to make America great, the faster its alliances erode. Japan, which for decades stood as a symbol of unwavering loyalty to the United States, may now be the first to switch lanes. If Japan cuts off tuna supplies and dumps its American bonds en masse, the rupture in U.S.-Japan relations will go down as one of the most dramatic geopolitical turning points of the 21st century. What once seemed like speculation now carries weight, with major publications like the Financial Times and Nikkei reporting on it. Insiders within Japan's government confirming restriction plans, and investors starting to sell American securities. This is no longer just talk. It is a real shift that could change global dynamics. What worries Washington most isn't just about fish or debt markets. Far more serious is Japan's emerging strategy to strike at one of America's weakest economic points, the automobile industry. According to Nikkei, Japanese officials are contemplating scenarios where giants like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan redirect their investments away from the United States to emerging markets in Asia such as Indonesia, India, or Vietnam. If this happens, the U.S. auto market could lose tens of thousands of jobs, and critical supply chains could unravel. Leading economists at Goldman Sachs warn that a decline in Japanese investment in the American auto sector could shrink the U.S. GDP by a full percentage point in just 3 years. This looming threat has sparked panic on Wall Street, with shares of General Motors and Ford plummeting over 6% after news of these potential restrictions surfaced. Investors fear a repeat of the 1980s trade wars, which nearly devastated entire American industries. But unlike back then, when Washington and Tokyo still managed to negotiate compromises, today's political climate under Trump makes such deals seem impossible. There is also a symbolic dimension to this crisis. Reports from the Financial Times indicate that behind closed doors at the IMF and World Bank, discussions are underway about Japan's willingness to back efforts to expand BRICS+. For now, Japan is only eyeing observer status, but even the possibility of engagement with this group shakes the geopolitical status quo. Just a year ago, it was unthinkable that America's closest ally would consider associating with a coalition dismissed by the White House as an alliance of losers. When pieced together, Trump's tariffs, threats to cut tuna exports, potential dumping of U.S. bonds, withdrawal of investments from the auto industry, and Japan's cautious outreach to China, it becomes clear the United States faces more than just a diplomatic hiccup. It risks losing the very foundation of its strategic policy in Asia. The tragic irony is that the rupture has been triggered by the White House's own policies. We are witnessing history turning a page where diplomacy morphs into a survival struggle. Should Trump persist on this course, he may well go down in history as the president who shattered the U.S.-Japan alliance. The world as we know it will change, and Japan might no longer stand alongside the United States but firmly on the opposite.